Well, good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome each one of you here this morning to a director's forum with Lonnie Bunch, who is the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Smithsonian Institution has a unique and daunting task. Through its museums, research, and outreach, it educates the American people about who we are, where we have been, and where we want to go as a nation. As the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the Wilson Center is privileged to be a part of that mission. Until recently, the Smithsonian was incomplete. There was no national museum devoted to African American life, art, history, and culture. Try to imagine telling the history of America without including the African American experience in all of its richness, tragedy, and triumph. And you understand just how much this museum was needed. In 2003, President Bush signed legislation creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And in January of this year, a site for the museum was chosen on the National Mall, adjacent to the Washington Monument. The museum, of course, will be a neighbor of ours. Today, we are pleased to hear from the museum's founding director, Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie is an historian, museum executive, educator, author. He previously served as the president of the Chicago Historical Society, one of the nation's oldest museums of history, from 2001 to 2005. While in Chicago, his efforts to reach out to diverse communities and to transform an institution reaching 150 years old were widely acclaimed. He is no stranger to the Smithsonian. From 1989 to the year 2000, he worked at the National Museum of American History, rising to become Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs. He played a key role in developing the major permanent exhibition, American Presidency, A Glorious Burden. Before joining the Smithsonian, he served as curator of history for the California Afro-American Museum in Los Angeles from 1983 to 1989. He holds graduate and undergraduate degrees from American University here in Washington. He has taught, lectured, and written extensively on topics ranging from the Black experience in the United States military to the impact of funding and politics on American museums. We're just very pleased this morning to have him here to talk about the challenge of building the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Lonnie Bunch, we welcome you to the Wilson Center, and we look forward to your comments. After his comments, he will, of course, take a few questions. Lonnie.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those kind words. I am very, very pleased to be here. I think it's always challenging when you ask a historian to speak because there's nothing we like better than a microphone and a captive audience. I wanted to start with a little story that kind of shapes what I think this museum is about. Early in my career, I was asked to do a major exhibition at the Smithsonian on the history of 19th century America. And one of the stories I wanted to tell was the story of slavery. And I decided I wanted to find a particular plantation that I would use as the lens to be able to explore that story. I traveled around the country looking for plantations. When I was taken to one that was on the old Waccamaw Neck above Georgetown, South Carolina, was the old Friendfield rice plantation. And when I went back down through the swamps and I turned the corner and there was an amazing sight, a slave street, of 15 cabins still extant. And standing next to one cabin was a man, Mr. Johnson, who was in his 90s. And Mr. Johnson had lived in this slave cabin with his slave grandmother. Clearly, he was going to be this wonderful informant for me to help me understand how to interpret this cabin. Mr. Johnson took me to the front of the cabin, and he talked about how the slaves used this sort of cut-off broom to do a hard sweep, to rub the ground so hard that there'd be no grass or there could be no vermin. He took me to one side of the cabin, and he talked about the role of slave children, watching the chimney to make sure it didn't fall or catch on fire. He took me to the back of the cabin and talked for a long time about the challenge of creating crops to supplement what the master gave the slaves. And then we went, or rather I went, to the fourth side. And Mr. Johnson didn't come. And I asked him, what happened over here? He said, nothing to say. And I said, well, why don't you come over here and tell me what happened? He said, I'm not coming over there. I begged him to come. He didn't. We continued to walk around the cabin. We went inside the cabin. We talked about the issues of privacy in the cabin. Then we went back to that fourth site, or I went back again, and I said, Mr. Johnson, please, what happened over here? Come over here and talk to me. He said, not going over there. Finally, I did what all Washingtonians do. I said, I came all the way down from Washington, D.C. Help me out. What happened here? Why aren't you coming over here? He said, simple. I'm not going over there because there are nothing but rattlesnakes over there. Now, after I stopped running, I asked Mr. Johnson, I said, why didn't you tell me? First he said, well, all you people from Washington think you're so smart that I'm not going to tell you anything. But then he said words that were really important to me for the rest of my career. He said, everybody from around here knows the history of that spot. And he said, it's really important that people remember and acknowledge the past. And then he said under his breath, this is a good example for you that not knowing your history will hurt you. So in some ways, I've never forgotten the snakes, but I've never forgotten Mr. Johnson and his call to remember and to acknowledge. And in some ways, the National Museum of African American History and Culture comes out of that call to remember, to acknowledge. It has a wonderfully interesting history. This museum began as an idea before World War I. In 1913, there was that famous reunion at Gettysburg, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, where graying Union soldiers and graying soldiers of the Confederacy shook hands to demonstrate the bond that the war was over. But black Americans, especially black veterans, said, what about us? We weren't allowed to be part of that. So there was a desire, a discussion around the country in the black community to create a memorial, a monument to the black Civil War soldier on the mall. And in 1916, they actually sent out circulars trying to raise money for that. That idea morphed over the next decade into creating a museum. And in fact, in 1929, Calvin Coolidge signed a bill to create a national museum of what then knows of Negro history on the mall. Unfortunately, the Depression hit, and that idea died. But the notion of a black museum on the mall, of a presence to celebrate and acknowledge African American culture, didn't die. In the 1960s, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, again, there was this call to remember. But again, the call didn't get off the ground. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was renewed pressure. Members of Congress like Congressman John Lewis began to demand to create a piece of legislation that would lead to this museum. Legislation almost passed Congress several times in the 90s, but again, failed. But as in the late 90s and the early 2000s, this bill was passed, signed by President Bush, and it's important to recognize why it passed. I think this bill, this museum is a reality today for several reasons. First, I think it really is the kind of bipartisan support that really rallied around this. You had people like Senator Sam Brownback and John Lewis and J.C. Watts and Senator Cleveland. And you have people who recognize, regardless of what side of the aisle, how important this story is for Americans. But also, quite honestly, we had 40 years of scholarship. legitimate work that has really helped to centralize the interpretation of African American culture throughout the historical profession. And in some ways, though it didn't need it, this scholarship legitimized African American culture. And also, we cannot underestimate the power of money. There is a middle class community that began to put money into celebrating and exploring African American culture. All of this led to this museum, I think, becoming a reality. But one of the questions one always wrestles with is, why? Why this museum now? You could make an argument, as my youngest daughter once did, that the day and age of her lives, she's got friends that are black and white. She sees Oprah and Colin Powell on TV. Is there still a need for this kind of institution? So the question is why? I would argue that there are still very important reasons why this museum should exist. I would argue that the first reason is something very simple. It's simply the danger of forgetting. I would suggest that you could tell a great deal about a country, about a people, by what it chooses to remember, by what it builds monuments to celebrate, by what graces the walls of its museums. Travel around the world and you see identity shaped through these museums. Throughout Scandinavia, there are museums and monuments that celebrate the Vikings as this proud symbol of Nordic curiosity, exploration, and freedom. In Scotland, much is made of the heroic struggles of William Wallace and the need to throw off the yoke of British domination. Until recently, if you went anywhere in South Africa, you were confronted by monuments and memories of the Voortrekkers. While in the United States, walk around Washington and see museums and monuments that revel in Civil War battles, founding fathers, with an occasional president thrown in. Yet I would suggest you learn even more about a country by what it chooses to forget. This desire to omit, to forget disappointments, to not acknowledge moments of real evil and great missteps is both instructive and natural. Yet I would suggest to you that it is often the essence of African American culture that is forgotten or downplayed. And yet, in some ways, African American culture is nothing if not a clarion call to remember. One example of that need to remember is really the nexus of race and memory that plays out in sort of one of the great unmentionables of public discourse, and that's the story of slavery. That while as scholars we wrestle with slavery and its meaning, and yet there are few places for the public to really wrestle with its history, its story, and its contemporary resonance. We all know who study slavery that for 250 years, slavery not only existed, but it was the dominant force in American life. Political clout and economic fortune depended on the life of slavery. Almost every aspect of American life, from business to religion, from culture to commerce, from foreign policy to westward expansion, all was shaped by slavery. American slavery was so dominant that 90% of the world's cotton was produced in the South. We were the OPEC of the 19th century. And by 1860, the monetary value of slaves outweighed all the money invested in railroads, banking, and industry combined. And yet this story, the centrality of slavery, the importance of slavery, is a story that is often not told in many of our institutions. There are even fewer opportunities to discuss candidly the legacy and the meaning of this. And I've been struck by a survey that was taken by the Smithsonian in the early 90s, where 5,000 people were interviewed. And of those folks, 81% of the white respondents felt that slavery was a history, though important, that had little to do with white America. And 73% felt that slavery was an important story whose real relevance was only to black America. But even more troubling was the fact that 62% of black Americans surveyed expressed either no interest or embarrassment by slavery. This is an important issue for me because I'm always struck by the need to help Americans understand issues like slavery because they're at the root of many of our challenges over issues of race in this country. And in some ways, if this museum could do many things, one of the things I'd love it to do is to help all Americans grapple with the question of slavery and help African Americans especially get over this sense of being ashamed about one's ancestors. Quite honestly, I'm in awe of one slave's ancestors. I'm in awe of their ability to maintain their culture, their humanity, their family. I wish more people could remember the words of William Prescott, who was a slave on that South Carolina plantation that I looked at, who, when he was asked by a WPA interviewer near the end of his life, he said, he was asked, will people remember slavery? And he said, it's a shame that they will remember that we were sold, but not that we were strong. They will remember that we were bought, but not that we were brave. And in some ways, one of the reasons why you craft a museum like this is to begin to help people grapple with these kinds of issues. But also, most importantly, this museum is really a wonderful mirror on America. That this museum, and by exploring African American culture, it really illuminates all the dark corners of the American experience. This museum, and using African American culture as a mirror, will help us all see where America has lived up to its ideals and where America is still a work in progress. In some ways, what this museum has the opportunity to do and why it's so important is that it really can help us understand our differences, but it could also help us see the commonalities of people coming together to make America better. So in essence, what is this place, this new museum we're going to create? What is the National Museum of African American History and Culture? Well, first of all, it is that place, as Mr. Johnson said, that place to remember. It is the place to remember the people you know. It is to remember Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. It is the place to remember Frederick Douglass. It is the place to remember Paul Robeson. But it's also the place to remember the nameless slave who got up every morning to keep her family together. It is also the place to remember the family that left southern Mississippi for the south side of Chicago in search of a better life and through whose actions changed dramatically what Chicago became as a city. But it's also a place where you hear those individual stories so that you don't see the story of the slavery per se, but the story of the individual. It is a place where I also want people, though, not to revel just in the shadow. I want people to be able to tap their toes to Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Aretha Franklin, or any of the array of hip-hop people who only my daughter understands. I want this to be a place where the public gets to revel in and honor the African American history and culture, to explore its richness, to understand the lessons, and to grapple with the ambiguities of race that are still so strong in our life. But in all honesty, if that's all the museum does, it's a missed opportunity. That in some ways, the real challenge is to create a museum that uses African American culture as a lens into what it means to be an American, as a way to help people understand how American identity is fundamentally shaped by questions of race and African American culture. Think about it. We talk often in America about our core values. We talk often about values of equality, resiliency, optimism, spirituality. Where better to look than the African American community and its history to understand the roots of those core values? We talk often about the promise of American life and the limits of that promise. Where better to look than the African American community to understand that tension between who we are and who we want to be? Where better, I would argue, than the African American experience to help the public understand who we are, who we were, and who we could be. I would argue the other piece of this museum is the opportunity to wrestle with global considerations. Americans still struggle to understand their place in a global world, the importance of international issues. I would argue that this museum has a wonderful opportunity to help people see how international considerations, not just the slave trade, but throughout our history, have shaped how race plays out in this country. I would love to see an exhibition that looks at the intersection of race and urbanization in Lagos, Liverpool, and Los Angeles, to really begin to explore the connectivity that we all have as a result of this. I would also suggest that the fourth leg of this museum, if we're really going to be the kind of entity that we need to be, is really collaboration. We really need to be a 21st century museum. When you look at the Smithsonian is considered the national museums. And yet, national really means, in most cases, big and in Washington. The challenge for us is to figure out how to create a museum that really has relationships outside of the city of Washington, that is really of value to museums, whether they are in Cincinnati or Savannah or Dallas. In some ways, the challenge for this museum is to become a beacon of African American history and culture that draws people to Washington, that makes them come to revel in the stories, to see the artifacts, to understand the individuals. And then, through technology and other ways, we push you back. So that therefore, if you come in and see an exhibition that looks at the migration of blacks from the South to the North, you should also be encouraged to go back to the DuSable Museum in Chicago, or the California African American Museum, or the August Wilson Center in Pittsburgh, to look at how that story plays out in a local context. So the challenge for us is not simply to be the best place we can be on the mall, but to really be a place of collaboration. And when you think about this museum and building this museum, there are wonderful challenges that shape what we will do, that we have to wrestle with. I always tell people that at 8 o'clock in the morning, this is the best job in America. At 2 o'clock in the morning, it's the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. But thank goodness 8 a.m. always comes back around. In some ways, when you think about the challenges of building a national museum, one of the first challenges is really just intellectual. What does national mean? In some ways, when the Museum of American History was opened in 1964, the notion of what that museum was simple. It was a Cold War creation. It was a museum that explored history and technology. The notion was that the Soviets had beat us into space, but we as a people have had this wonderful history of conquering technology. So even though that was a momentary blip, have confidence, because look at what we've been able to do. Well, the question becomes, what is the storyline for this museum? What is the overarching framework that holds this together? There are so many questions intellectually that we have to wrestle with. What's the role of Africa in an African American museum? How do you determine what stories that we can tell that allow us to transcend the traditional way African diaspora is explored? In most museums around the world, African diaspora is looked at as a simple notion, that there are people of African descent here, wherever here is, Puerto Rico, Bahamas, Canada, and the goal is, how do we take something that looks at the diaspora in a richer, more interesting way? How do we figure out how to get our hands around this whole story that is African American culture? There are obvious stories one has to tell. One has to tell the story of slavery, of Jim Crow, of civil rights. But then, do you tell the story of the black military experience? Do you tell the story of blacks in sport? What about in film or theater? How much do you explore really difficult moments like lynching? How do you find in a museum the right tension between giving the public what it wants and giving the public what it needs? Because in some ways, finding that balance intellectually is one of the great challenges of this museum. And how to do that in a way that's not numbingly linear. When you go to most history museums, you begin at a date, you run out of steam about 1920, and maybe one day you see the end of the museum. How do you craft a museum that really gives people with a space that's large, with a story this big, give people a way to access and own the story so that you beat back museum fatigue? How do you do that utilizing technology in a way that works for the audiences you get at the Smithsonian? Every other museum in America would give their eye teeth to get 1 million visitors a year. At the Smithsonian, you're going to get 7 to 10 million a year. How do you craft a building that works? So it's really sort of wrestling with those questions. And then how do you tell these stories that are really about fundamentally American identity? How do you take us from looking at this from an African-American perspective to a broader national story? And finally, you begin to wrestle with this question of what does being African-American really mean today anyway? Who's an African-American? And you begin to wrestle with those sort of wonderful intellectual issues, which quite candidly are part of the reason I took the job. That's the fun part. The less fun part is fundraising. When you think about how much money has to be raised, I was talking to my mother for Mother's Day, and she was asking me how much money I have to raise, and I was thinking, thanks for bringing that up. And I told her the number, and she said to me, as only a mother can say, she said, "Son, that's more money than God can count." That is one of the great challenges, is that to build this museum, it's probably going to cost $500 million, of which you're going to have to raise from the private sector at least $250 to $300 million. And legislatively, Congress is supposed to pay for the rest of the cost. But you could imagine why this is a challenge. If you actually figure this out, it basically means that over the next 5 years, I've got to raise roughly $500,000 a week. I try not to think about it in that number. But that what is really wonderful, however, about that challenge is this museum has put together what I think is the best board in America. Not only does it have the people like Oprah Winfrey, who have never served on any board before, or Bob Johnson of Black Entertainment Television, but it has the CEOs of American Express, Merrill Lynch, Time Warner, Rubicon and Young, IBM, so that in essence, the number is great, but so too are the people who are committed to putting their shoulders to the wheel to make this work. The challenge for me is to figure out, how do you manage such a group? How do you keep that kind of group engaged? You know, when they built the Indian Museum and the Holocaust Museum, it took roughly 15 years. Imagine telling Oprah Winfrey, have patience, 15 years, we'll get this done. Her notion to me was, well, I can transform a network in 2 years. And so in a way, the challenge is to take this group of people and keep them engaged, figure out how to use them, and how to make them accessible, because they're so busy. But yet, what is wonderful is that when you hear them talk, you realize that there is this wonderful commitment, not just in the room, but nationally, to make the money part of this the easiest part. I think the harder part, and the part people most worry about, is really Congress, is the fact that not only are we expecting Congress to pay 50%, but even more challenging is the fact that this museum has to grow annually in terms of staff in order to be able to do the work that's needed to get a building up in less than a decade. And I think that one of the things that I'm learning a lot about, even though I had a lot of experience before, is working on the Hill in light of the challenges of everything from Katrina to war to economic considerations. So in some ways, one of the great challenges, one of the great unknowns, is how effectively we will work in Congress to get the kind of both annual support and long-term support that this museum needs. But I would argue that there are three other challenges that are crucial and that are difficult for this museum to wrestle with. One is building the collections. When you walk into a Smithsonian museum, the thing that strikes you is the wonders of the collection. The Wright Flyer, the Greensboro lunch counter, the Hope Diamond. And so the question becomes, how do you build a collection for this national museum? While you may revel in technology and use it effectively, you still have to have the stuff that inspires, that allows people to remember, that shapes their experience. And so the Smithsonian, in all that it has, even if I use everything already in the walls of the Smithsonian, it's only about 20% of what we need. So I've got to find 80% of the collections of this museum. And that's a challenge because over the last 20 years, African American material suddenly has become in vogue by collectors. Things that were once donated now are seen as the sort of foundation of a next generation's wealth. So the challenge is, how do you build those collections? Part of it is to go to people like Bill Cosby and others and say, how do you help this museum? Not by giving up all of your collection, but by giving a part to the Smithsonian. But more importantly, the way we wrestle with this challenge is to realize that most of the African American cultural patrimony is still in private hands, still in the homes, still in the basements, still in the attics of most African Americans around the country. And so what we have to do is create a national collecting initiative, a kind of save our African American treasures that allows us to work regionally with institutions to actually find this material, to help people preserve it in their own homes, to stimulate giving at the local level so that the Chicago Historical Society and other places get this material, but to then make sure that a small percentage comes to Washington to allow us to have the collections that we really need. I would argue the next challenge that is so big for us is actually building a building. Imagine what it's like to build a building on the mall. The regulatory issues by themselves take a year or two just to wrestle with. But then what's been most instructive to me is I didn't realize how many friends I had who are architects. Almost every architect in the world has called about building what will be the last major facility on the National Mall. So the challenge is both, it's wonderful to have that interest, but how do you create a process that is inclusive, that makes sure African American architects get to be into this mix, that allows you to create a facility that does the work you need it to do? Wonderful exhibitions, wonderful collections, but it also has to be something that is stellar because of where it's located. As we've said, it's on the corner of Constitution between 14th and 15th Street, or as we like to say, the intersection of the Constitution and the 14th and 15th Amendment. It's like the place for it to be. But the challenge is in the shadow of the White House, in the Washington Monument, with the Museum of American History. How do you craft something? Especially because the National Museum of the American Indian raised the bar by crafting the kind of building that people say, my goodness, that really does what you want a building to do. It begins to prepare you for what you're going to experience before you walk in the door. So crafting that building is really going to be a challenge. And then I would argue one of the things that's most interesting to me is that when I took this job and walked into my offices, I had one staff person. And so building a leadership team of 50 people to begin to work over the next several years to move this institution is really an interesting challenge. It's much like going on a cruise at the same time you're building the boat. So it's both very invigorating and a tad frightening. But finally, it seems to me when you think about what is really one of the great challenges of this museum is to really manage expectations, to really help everyone, whether it's the staff, the Smithsonian bureaucracy, the press, Congress, myself, to recognize that this is a marathon, not a sprint. That even if you do it right, it's a decade in the making. And that you've got to think carefully of the strategies to maintain the kind of interest and support, to think about the kinds of people who work now, who may come later, to make sure that you don't burn everybody out in 3 years so that you can make this museum a reality. So the question that sometimes I ask myself, and often my youngest daughter asks me, which is, why take this on? You were at the Chicago Historical Society, you fooled the city, they liked you. Why come back to Washington? Well, it seems to me that this museum is crucially important on so many levels. But one of the levels that's really important is that this museum really has an opportunity to really help Americans grapple with questions of race, to really help Americans understand and embrace and revel in and learn from the African American experience. The chance to help make a dream that has been the dream of many generations and many people a reality is very, very powerful. I always said that working at the Chicago Historical Society really nurtured my soul. But coming back here to help to craft this museum nurtures the souls of my ancestors, and there's nothing more powerful than that. And I guess if we do this job right, this museum will really help us to remember. It will remind us of what we once were as a people, as a nation. But if we do it right, it'll also remind us of the challenges, the chasms that we still have to overcome in this society. But if we do it right, we'll also come away with the optimism, with the resiliency of this culture that will point us towards what we can become. Ultimately, what I measure for success of this museum is, on the one hand, is it a museum that's worthy of the Smithsonian? But more importantly, is it a museum that is worthy of the richness of African American history and culture? That's what keeps us going. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lonnie Bunch. Let's open it up for a few questions. If you have them, we'll begin back here, okay?
Hi, Mr. Bunch. I work with the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name's Acacia Reed. And I just want to say I really admire the job that you've taken on, but I also must say I don't envy you. I was just thinking about your talk and how you say you want to make this a 21st century museum, how you want to reach out to cities and to other countries outside of the U.S., of course. And I was also wondering if you thought about how you're going to get the museum and the message of the museum into the local school system, because, of course, Washington is a great draw for many people. So many people won't have the opportunity, and we want to get this message out to as many people as possible. And school seems to be the best avenue. So I was wondering if you considered that in your plan. Thank you.
Yes. There are really several things that are about the plan that really wrestle with the questions you raised. First of all, I'm really committed to being a museum in Washington, D.C. Often the Smithsonian sometimes forgets where it's located. And I really want to make sure that the work that we do will really also serve a local audience, recognizing that we are a national institution. I want to serve that local audience. So we're committed to thinking about how we are an educational entity, and what does that mean locally, and what does that mean nationally. One of the things that meant a lot to me in Chicago was crafting a major program that looked at teenagers and thinking about ways to engage teenagers with history. My hope is that we will take that model and begin to use it around the country in a collaborative way to begin to engage teenagers on the question of history. Because I think what happens is museums do a wonderful job with real little kids. They do even a better job with adults. They do a miserable job with teenagers. Most museums are very comfortable when teenagers walk out the door, not in the door. And so our goal is to think how we create programs that allow teenagers and children to feel committed to history, so that ultimately history is not something that you simply come to later in life.
A question here, front, Peter.
Will this museum have any impact on the Smithsonian Museum in Anacostia?
The Anacostia Museum was really a pioneering institution because it was the first institution that said we are a community-driven institution. That is something that should never go away. So this museum will be a partner with the Anacostia Museum, but I think it's important that the Anacostia Museum continue to do the work that it does in the local community to make sure that Anacostia is serviced by that particular museum. So my goal is to be a partner to work with it effectively in the years to come.
Question here, and then back there, Maria.
Hi, Schroeder Cherry with the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You talked about the majority of patrimony with African American history and culture being in private hands. And what is your vision for helping those people who have these things in private hands deal with conservation or preservation?
We are, as part of this sort of Save Our National Treasures, we've been in conversation with conservators, experts around the country to really bring them into local communities, so that as part of the process is we want to make sure that if you want to keep these photographs in your family's collection, you'll learn how to preserve them so that they'll be there for the next generation or so. Our goal is not simply to collect, but to preserve. And so our hope is to work with an array of partners, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Association of African American Museums, an array of entities who are interested in helping people preserve what's in their homes. And I think that's really one of the values that we have as a staff, not to take everything, but to work collaboratively to make sure it's preserved.
Okay.
Sonia Michelle, I'm a fellow here this year. One of the wonderful implications of the scholarship that's been done in African American history over the last 40 years is the fact that African American history and culture has become integrated into a number of public institutions like the the Museum of American History, National Gallery, the Chicago Historical Society, and as Lee talked about your biography, I realized I'd probably been following your exhibits around the country over the last, or exhibits that you undoubtedly instigated around the country over the last few years. I'm just wondering, are you concerned that having a Museum of African American History will lead to kind of ghettoization, will sort of stop that effort at integration of African American history into other kinds of institutions?
I would argue that in some ways this will help the evolution of that, because part of what the Smithsonian does is legitimize things. That there are a lot of places that begin to explore African American culture, but there's still a lot of institutions that don't. And I think the other side of it is, and this is going to sound strange, but American museums are really one of the last great bastions of Jim Crowism. You go to a museum and there will be a separate black story. It is rarely interfaced with the rest of the story of Chicago or other things. One of the things I want to do is in this museum is get beyond that, is take this culture and explore it in a way that you begin to see the connectivity. You begin to see it not as an ancillary story, but as a central story. My expectation is, knowing that the museum profession loves models and messiahs, that eventually that kind of change will have an impact on that. The other thing I'll say about that is that I've thought a lot about that question, and in a way, part of what it's like is almost sort of Civil War battlefields. There's a million Civil War battlefields, and that when they do their job right, each one tells us a little something different about the Civil War. My goal is to sort of take American culture, look at it through a different kind of lens, but that it will be a lens that will be as equally valid as what's happening in American history, but it'll give people other opportunities to think about interpreting that culture differently in their own institutions.
All right, a question here.
Good morning, Lonnie. Steve Lewis with GSA's Office of the Chief Architect, Design Excellence Program, and today here again representing the National Organization of Minority Architects. One of the daunting tasks that face not necessarily yourself but the Smithsonian Institution is in the process of selecting an architect to design this project. And of course, NOMA is sitting on the edge of their seat, concerned about the process that will recognize and respect our need to be inclusive and open to competition among national firms and all firms for that matter who exhibit design excellence. But in the course of our African American architects rising to the levels of excellence that are, we believe, commensurate with all of those across the country, we feel concern about how the Smithsonian will recognize the importance that this project be interpreted, let us say, by those among us who have that demonstrated ability. How, in your mind, will the Smithsonian tackle this task?
I'd love to say it's the Smithsonian's task. It's my task. I think that several things have to be kept in mind. Is that, first of all, I have been spending a lot of time talking to a lot of architects, minority and not, to begin to get their guidance on what's the fairest process. What's the best process that'll work? There are many architects who feel it has to be a design-built competition. Let me bring you my best model forward. There are others who think that's less fair. So we're really now gathering all the data so that I can put in place a process a year from now that will really allow us to make sure that we've got not only fair representation, but the designers and the architects are people who understand the centrality of this culture, the nuances of this culture, so that we want to make sure that more than anything else, that process is fair, inclusive, and will give us what all Americans deserve, the best creative vision possible.
Okay, two more questions and we'll wrap it up. One back here and one here.
My name is Carol Kelly. I worked for 10 years at the Ellis Island Immigration Museum, and so what I offer is not a question particularly, but just an experience that may help with your collections challenge. It may be something that you're already familiar with. At the time of its opening, Ellis Island did have an impressive museum display of immigrant artifacts. But what transpired over the next 10 years was that Ellis Island, in effect, became America's addict, because the existing displays prompted people in overwhelming numbers, I think, to contribute to the museum their personal effects related to their families and its immigration history. I don't know how you could structure that process at the point that you are at now in terms of beginning a collection, but I can confirm that vast numbers of materials and artifacts are accessible once there is a demonstration of the popular and the cultural interest in those items. It really is America's closet. And unfortunately, much of that material stays in the attic and in the closet because the sequence obviously occurred after the establishment of the primary exhibits.
I think that the work that Ellis Island does is one of the models that we're looking at. What I've been struck by is we've launched a kind of campaign of visibility where I'm sort of traveling a lot, doing the AMTV Milwaukee, AMTV LA, and that those conversations have led to hundreds of people already contacting us about collections, about things that many want to give, some want to sell, but it really is a model that we're going to use, which is to create programming now. My argument is that the museum exists now, I just don't have a building. So we're about to launch traveling exhibitions, programs around the country, collaborations, so that each of those programs will be a concrete presence, and that presence should stimulate giving and stimulate the growth of the collection. So your model is right where we're trying to get.
Final question here.
Mr. Bunch, Pat Breslin from the Inter-American Foundation. I wonder if you'd say something about how much attention the museum will be able to give to the diaspora experience in Latin America.
One of the things that I think is crucially important is to be able to explore the African diaspora. I want to explore it in a way that's more than just saying there are blacks in Brazil and Bolivia and other places. I want to begin to think about why this culture has such an impact globally, why it resonates globally. What I was struck by was I'd been at work maybe 3 or 4 weeks and some article had come out. I get a call at 6:30 at night, and it's somebody who is flying in from Bolivia who wanted to come by and see me. Turned out he identified himself as a black Bolivian, and he brought me an artifact that he felt was representative of his culture. It was this beautiful artifact that was hand-carved by his great-grandmother. But as we sat down to talk, he talked powerfully about how important it was for the Smithsonian, for this museum, to do more than a small exhibition on Africa, that really to try to create a sense that this is still, the diaspora is vibrant, alive, and helping to transform many nations as we speak. So for me, it is going to be one of the important stories we tell. What percentage of gallery space it has, I don't know. But that, in my mind, it is one of the things that we talk about all the time when we bring our scholars together, when we travel overseas. The conversation really is, how does the diaspora get explored in a way that helps the visitor see its central understanding who African Americans are today?
Well, I think we all understand better the challenge of building that museum, and we all feel that it's going to be in the very good hands of the director, Lonnie Bunch. Thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Don't forget what I told you.
I'll make sure we do.